everybody, and welcome to our inaugural session for 2021 of Business Skills for Creatives. We are here live from General Provision in Fat Village in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, but we certainly welcome everybody joining us both here locally, around the country, and maybe even around the world. This is a continuation of our award-winning series in 2020, which brought artists during the pandemic a way to bring their creative vision to life and build a successful business. This is our first workshop of the 2021 series, and while the 2020 workshops are not prerequisites, you can always go back to our YouTube channel and watch the other sessions in order to build your skills and help build a better business as an artist and as a creative. I must let you know that these sessions are being recorded and that closed captioning in English is available, although you have to enable them on your own device, whether it's through YouTube or Facebook, however you are tuning in. And we have found that the closed captioning function works best on Facebook. Today, we'll be speaking with Angela Richardson from the Grantsmanship Center on applying for grant funding as an artist. Before we get to that and introducing Angela, I do want to say that this is a program of the Broward County Cultural Division, and we are the local arts agency for Broward County, Florida. My name is Phil Dunlap. I am the director of the Broward County Cultural Division. I apologize, I should have introduced myself first. Now back to Angela, and who will be presenting our workshop for today. Angela Richardson is an internationally recognized nonprofit leader with executive expertise in successful program development, fund development, strategic planning, and organizational coaching. She's held leadership positions at community-based organizations at Brown University, and she's worked with both large and small organizations and colleges across the United States, Mexico, and Brazil. Angela is a trainer for the Grantsmanship Center, as well as a principal consultant at her arts-based consulting firm, which services the nonprofit community. She's reviewed proposals for the U.S. Department of Education and for local arts commissions in Los Angeles and Rhode Island. And she holds a master's degree in arts administration from Columbia University and a bachelor's degree from Spelman College. So Angela, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. It's great to be here.
Yeah, now we're excited to kick off and hand it over to you. I will let the audience know that we're going to be taking questions periodically throughout the presentation at 2 points, one sort of in the middle and one a little bit toward the end. So those of you watching, if you have questions, put them in the chat box and then we can throw them up on the screen when we get to the question time, or you can wait until we get to the Q&A session to put them in. But regardless, Angela, I'm going to turn it over to you for this first section of your presentation.
Okay, great. I'm looking forward to it. Well, welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to be here. As Phil mentioned, my name is Angela Richardson and I'm representing the Grantsmanship Center. We are based here based in Los Angeles, which is where I am broadcasting from nice and early. So today we're going to talk about grant funding, especially for individual artists. And it's a really unique position to be an individual artist seeking grant funding. So we're going to talk about some things that come up and what does it mean to be ready as an artist. And I don't mean ready in terms of your craft. I mean this is a business skills program. And so to be ready in terms of the administrative part of your artistry. We'll talk about what actually goes in a grant proposal anyway. Sometimes these guidelines can be confusing, or we don't know exactly what certain terms mean. So we're going to talk about all of those core components so we can know what the guidelines are asking and how to make those more compelling for grant makers. We'll also talk about the types of grant makers that are out there. And then finally, we're going to touch on creating a realistic budget, because after all, grant proposals are about, among the things that they're about is securing grant funding so that we can do our artistry more. Next slide, please. So I want to start with this term, what is grantsmanship? So as I mentioned, I represent the Grantsmanship Center, and I always start most of my trainings with why this fancy topic? What is this? A lot of workshops you'll see out there will say writing grant proposals or grant writing 101. So what is this grantsmanship, and why is the center called that? And what do we mean for you as grant seekers when we talk about grantsmanship skills? Well, if you look at this word even, it might remind you of some other words like craftsmanship or sportsmanship or workmanship. So all of these things, when you think about them, they hint at a set of skill and then something beyond just the basic set of skills, right? So when we think about craftsmanship, for example, there is the craft. Let's say I'm a furniture maker. There is the basic skills of building, let's say, a table. But the craftsmanship comes in the artistry of it, the thing that makes it unique, beautiful, stand out, different from another craftsman or craftswoman or craftsperson. And so the same is true with grantsmanship. Grantsmanship really it alludes to the fact that there's a set of skills that goes into writing grant proposals, seeking grant proposals, grant makers, and writing these grant proposals. And then beyond that, there's also the relationship building. There's also the taking the long view on this, knowing that it's not about write this application, get this money, write this one, get this money, that there's something more that's available when it comes to writing grant proposals. And we're going to talk about what that is. So the first seed I want to lay is for you as individual artists. Next slide, please. Grantsmanship is also really important. A lot of times organizations think about it, but as individual artists, and I include myself in this because I'm also a writer. And so I have my own artistry that I'm always proliferating and seeking funding for as well. So we as individual artists also want to think about grantsmanship, because as this whole series is about, there's a business side to being an individual artist, and grants can be a tool in your toolbox when it comes to securing and shoring up the financial support for your creative life. So as artists, grantsmanship is important because it helps us to develop more polished grant proposals, to be better grant seekers, because there is something about being more polished as a grant seeker. And it also helps us to develop those relationships, which are a key point of seeking grant funding. The other reason grantsmanship is important for us as individual artists is because grantsmanship also alludes to the fact that it's not just about the writing. It's not just about getting a set of guidelines, answering the questions to the best of our ability, and then, sending it in, hoping we get it, and then maybe going on to another one. When it comes to grantsmanship, we, as individual artists, just like organizations, we can plan out the arc of our year in terms of our projects, in terms of what we're working on, and look at how to best fund that, to find different funders, more than one, to fund the different projects that we want to do. So grantsmanship also alludes to the planning that goes into seeking grant funding along with the writing of the proposals. So just stay with me here, because I'm going to, add more details to this as we go along. Next slide, please. So what is a grant proposal anyways? For those of you, I noticed on the list of people that are coming, many of you are emerging or maybe established in your artistry, but not as much in your business skills. So I don't want to take anything for granted. A grant proposal, very simply, it's a document that we write, or a set of guidelines. It could be an online document, or sometimes we have to write them, that we as artists submit to grant makers to secure money. Next slide, please. But it is about so much more than the money. It is about how do we proliferate our work? How do we let people know about our work? How do we leverage the proposals and the monies that we secure? How do we build relationships through this grant seeking? Because it's a beautiful way to build relationships. I had a mentor of mine once say that, as artists or as individuals in arts organizations, sometimes grant seeking is one of our best marketing tools that we can use, because we're constantly letting people know about what it is that we do. Some of those proposals we get, some of them we don't. So it's about much more than the money. And I want to, those of you that are new at this, and if you get a rejection or this or that, don't be discouraged, because this is an ongoing process that we as creatives will be engaged with throughout the life of our career. Next slide, please. So there's different types of funders that are out there, and I want to give a very kind of brief overview of the types that you'll find out there, because they respond and react differently, or they require different things. So we have private funders. Private funders include our private foundations. They include corporate foundations, so those foundations that are affiliated with corporations, obviously, that are oftentimes related to their the mission or whatever their corporate interests are. There's public charities and community foundations that are really focused on the local community and shoring that up. And there's other associations, and that can be any kind of professional entity that also does, like, think about the Rotary Club would be an example of that. So those are private funders. And one thing to note about private funders is they are so different. Sometimes they're organized by an individual, sometimes it's a group of individuals. So when you know one private funder, you know exactly one, and all of them operate just a little bit different. So that's why it's like relationship building, getting to know who they are, getting to know whether or not you're eligible to apply, because with private funding, sometimes they only give to organizations. And so not all the time, but certainly some of the time. So it's good to check that out before you go too far into the guidelines. Next slide, please. And then there's government funders like Broward County, the Cultural Division. And we love them because they are focused on they're focused on the communities that we live in. So there's federal government funders, there's state government funders, there's county, and even the city and town. So for example, here in Los Angeles, where there's our county, there's the city, and then even within that, sometimes there's small neighborhood pots of money as well. So they tend to operate very similarly, and whether or not you're in Florida or not, there's a way that you can find out which of the offices in your area give those kinds of funding. So there's a couple of websites that are coming up around where you can find some of these resources. Next slide, please. So in addition to the websites that are coming up, there's Candid and Arts Calendar and Americans for the Art. There's a great place for finding arts funding, both private and government. And then on this slide, you'll see some other funder research databases. When you're beginning to get into the field of prospecting, that's what we call it, prospecting for funders, my strongest advice is to always keep your ears open and to talk with each other and to talk with other artists and to look at where other artists are getting funded. And there's oftentimes grant maker panels that come up or webinars about grant funding. In fact, the Grantsmanship Center does a quarterly Meet the Grant Makers. It's a great place to learn about some of the grant makers and hear what they're looking at or interested in. And some of these databases are also locations where you can find grant makers. Most of these are paid resources. They're not terribly expensive, and sometimes you can just do them for just the month. But it's a great place to start to find grant makers and to then begin to keep a list. Not all of them will you apply for all at the same time, and maybe they'll fund different things. Individual artists, we do projects, we do fellowships, we do residencies. There's all different kinds of programs out there for individual artists, and these are a couple of resources where you can find them. I want to give I was looking at grants to individuals, the one down on the left, on Candid. That used to be the Foundation Center. So if you go to Candid, there's a lot of resources on there for, certainly funding opportunities, but also resources for like writing your artist statement and different things like that for individual artists. You can also see it on Americans for the Arts, have a lot of funding resources as well. So next slide, please. Okay, so working with private funders. How are they different from government funders? And the thing I really want to kind of point out here is that when it comes to private funders, the way foundations are organized, it could be a small family foundation, like let's say me and my cousins, we put together a foundation and we do small grant making to our local community. It could be as large as, you hear some of these large foundations like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example. Although that's not a great example because for obvious reasons in the news. But anyway, so that's an example of another larger foundation where they do all kinds of grant making, large grant making, small grant making, et cetera, or Ford Foundation would be another. So they're so different. And part of working with them is about building relationship with them. And I don't mean going out for coffee. I mean, clear communication that respects their systems, because they usually are very small. Their staff is very small. They're oftentimes open to communicating with grantees or prospective grantees, willing to answer questions. Oftentimes with private funders, for example, they may be so small that they don't even have a set of guidelines. And in that case, when we get later on in this webinar that we're doing here, I'm going to tell you about the core components that almost every grant maker asks, and so you can use what we're going to talk about in this webinar to submit grant proposals or fellowship proposals or what have you to them. So that's private funders. It's much more subjective. The way that they make decision making is subjective as well. We might know how their criteria, we might not. So there's just a lot more fluidity when it comes to private funders. Next slide, please. Federal or government grants are different. So because government grants are based on public dollars, our tax dollars, there's more visibility, there's more accountability for that. And the way that they review grant proposals is much more visible. They usually use a scoring criteria, so that you'll see that in their guidelines. So for example, next slide. Oh, no, not next slide. Sorry, not yet. When it comes to federal proposals, there's a criteria. So let's say they're looking at your work samples or they're looking at your artist statement. There's different things when it comes to government grants. And so the thing you want to know when it comes to government grants is that they oftentimes will require, because there's accountability, some more evaluation that maybe we as individual artists are not as accustomed to. We'll talk a little bit about that. And when it comes to funding, government funding, it can be a little volatile. And what I mean by volatile is the budgets, city governments or state governments or federal government budgets have to pass before they can allocate resources. And so just kind of keeping your ear to the ground around that is important when we get into the realm of government grant making. But the beautiful part about it is once those funding pockets are established, they tend to continue to be funded. Next slide, please. And then we want to take all of this information as we're beginning to do prospecting and organize it. This is some of our business back end. I don't know about you all, but certainly in my business, I spend at least one day a week, organizing the business of my creative life. And when it comes to grant seeking, you want to do this as well. So as individuals, we don't need, very, sophisticated databases like an organization might, but we do want to organize our information very similarly. And it's not just, oh, here's the grant maker, here's the amount, here's the project, and the deadlines, which is certainly what we want to organize. But this last section on notes, not every single funding opportunity will we apply for in that moment. Sometimes I keep mentioning something like taking the long view. So as we're prospecting, we're constantly looking for funders, funding opportunities, fellowships, residencies. And let's take a residency, for example. We have to align that with our life. So sometimes it's not the right time to do a fellowship, but at some point it might be. So if you keep an ongoing record, part of what you're doing with grant makers is looking to make the right fit at the right time. So some of the grant makers will fund projects, and some of them will fund community engagement, and some of them will fund a fellowship. So there's different things that we as artists do. And so you want to think about your year to the best of your ability, right? Think about what it looks like. Think about the kind of projects that you're involved in. Think about the kind of funding that you want you'll need, and then make a match. So oftentimes what individuals will do is they put the cart before the horse, meaning that, oh, here's a set of guidelines, let me write for this. Oh, here's a set of guidelines, let me write for this. So what I want to encourage is putting your creative life and your creative projects first, looking at what's needed there, looking at what your intention is for, the quarter or the year, and then looking for funders that will match that. Because if we do the opposite, if we fill out funders and then do what they're asking, oftentimes it's maybe not exactly what we want to be doing. And so that is a part of grantsmanship as well, where we do the planning for, okay, where am I in terms of the work that I'm doing? What is it that I as an artist need for the next, version of the work that I'm doing, or the next step of in my case, to the next version of my manuscript? What do I need there? Do I need to do a community project? Do I need a residency? What's the next logical step? And what funders might help support the work that I'm doing? Next slide, please. And so at this point, you might say, oh my gosh, this is maybe a little bit daunting. I didn't realize it was so complicated. And what I want to say is, I'm kind of laying out a buffet of information of things that you might see. But the first place you want to start is grant readiness. So whether or not you are in the realm of grant funding already, you're thinking about getting started, or even if you are already involved, there's a couple of things when it comes to grant readiness for individual artists. And I'm going to go through each one of these. So the first one in the upper left-hand quadrant is your social media and your online presence. We as artists, we're whether you're a visual artist, a media artist, whatever type of a theater artist, grant makers are looking, will want to see our work most often. And oftentimes they will do their due diligence on us just like we did on the foundation. So you want to have your social media and your online presence up, ready, active, and relevant to the types of things that you're going to be applying for. So if you're looking to do, let's say, a workshop in the community, then you want to make sure that in your online presence, there's things that show that demonstrate that are would support your application there. Grant makers do look at our social media. And then, of course, work samples is for private funders in particular. Sometimes everything hinges on our work samples, the quality of them, the clarity of them, what they show the grant maker about our work. So whether or not you're currently applying for grant funding, when you're starting to get ready, you can take an audit of your work samples that you have available. and look at if you need to shore them up, or what needs to happen. Are they high quality? Will they support your proposed project? How will they support the applications that you're writing? And then, of course, our artist bio and statements. I would add a resume to that as well. Do I need to update my artist information in any way? Do I have both a bio and a statement? Because they're different. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Does it reflect me as an artist right now? Sometimes we write them and we leave them and we just keep using them. But especially as we're getting ready to apply for more grant funding sources, we want to be up to date and ready to go when it comes to our bio and statement. And then lastly, our reader, right? Who can be a second reader for our applications? So that means once I have my work samples ready, once I have my narrative ready, who's going to be that champion? It could be another fellow artist. It can be a friend. It can be a mentor. Oftentimes what will happen, especially when we're just kind of getting our chops when it comes to seeking grant funding, we get very close to our work. And we've been working with it so long that everything makes sense to us. So having a second reader, having a person who can help make it really clear will be very helpful. What you want with your grant applications is for the reviewer to read it one time through and to know exactly what your project is, to get a sense of who you are as an artist, and what you want to do. A lot of times with many of the applications that I've reviewed, I'll read them. The work samples will be great, but the clarity around what the individual artist is actually wanting to do with the grant funding isn't as clear. So having a second reader can help bring some of that clarity. So at this point, I want to just pause. We'll talk about grant applications and what goes in them next. But just as the setup of the grant readiness and grantsmanship, I want to just pause and see if there's any questions before we go on. Phil, I can't. Oh, there we go.
Can you hear me? Okay.
I can hear you. Yes, thank you.
Might be a delay on my end. This is all, amazing information. I have experience on the artist side because I'm a jazz pianist. I've received grants as an individual artist, and I used to work for a nonprofit organization that applied for grants, that chased the money, that would do the very thing that you said or advised against, about looking for the opportunity, finding the guidelines, and then trying to take your project or something you were doing and kind of fit it into those guidelines. And so if you had to say what's probably the biggest or maybe the top two pitfalls that you've seen artists or even organizations, I guess, for that matter, sort of fall into within this whole process, what would you say are those big things, those two sort of top things that the artists really need to take into consideration if they were to prioritize?
Yeah, I would say grant funding is an opportunity for you to let your voice and your artistry, in the case of an organization, your mission, shine. I think that sometimes when we come to grant seeking, one of the pitfalls is that we as grant seekers take this pose of like, please give us the money, we as individual artists, right? And it's a partnership. Grant makers are looking for artists as much as artists are looking for grant seekers. And so one of the pitfalls that I see is that artists or organizations, they're trying to do what the funder wants them to do. When most of the time funders that I know, they're really looking to support artists or support organizations, and they're deferring to those organizations or individuals to know, well, tell us what you want to do and tell us how it relates to the community. So oftentimes we put the priority with the funder instead of putting the priority with our work.
I think that's so true. And speaking from the funder side, nothing is frustrating for us more when artists or organizations just approach us and say, "Hey, I need money." It's like, okay, we all need money, right?
Right. And that's exactly it. Like we all need money. And as a grant maker, I would imagine you're like, yes, and we are dispersed. We have grant funding for you, but tell us more, right? Tell
Exactly.
us what you want to do. We are interested. We want to support you. We are interested in the cultural environment of Broward County. We need more from you. So
Right.
exactly
I
it.
know we've got a few, I think 3 questions. They're
Okay.
my team's gonna throw them up here on the screen at some point. We're working on those right now. Okay, here we go. So everyone asked for cover letters. I'd like to ask what exactly we have to write in a cover letter.
What an excellent question. So I'm actually going to tell you exactly what to write in a cover letter. There are, you'll see it when we get to it next, but I will give you the tagline so you'll know when we get to it. There's core components that go into every grant application, give or take, right? Certainly stuff about your who you are as an artist, what you're going to do, what kind of goals and outcomes you want. I call them the core components. So when we get to that slide, you'll see the content of it. So just hold that question for just a moment. It's a great one.
And,
thank you.
Next question from the team. All right, Art Sanctum asks, thank you for this informative session. Question, does grant funding differ in certain states?
I would say yes. In this, I'm going to assume that you're talking about government grant funding, because in private, I would say absolutely it does. But in the case of government grant funding, I would say yes. There is a website, I think it's going to pop up a little bit later, the National State Arts Assembly, I think Assembly of Agencies, something like that, where there's links to different arts agencies that vary by state. It's going to be a little bit different, but as I was mentioning, the characteristics of government funding is going to be very, very similar. So a lot of the things that we're talking about today will be really relevant.
Great.
So for example, I looked at the guidelines for, no, it's okay. I looked at the guidelines for Broward County and I looked at the ones for LA County. They're very, very similar.
Yeah, I have to say from a public funding standpoint, we have a little less flexibility insofar as being specific with grant guidelines because it's public dollars and it has to be open and accessible by nature, to all. So where a private foundation may be able to steer specific dollars toward a specific demographic to address a specific problem, government sources of funding tend to be a little bit more general in providing those support just because of the nature of the public funding. So, and then team, we've got one more question before we move on. So Belle Jackson, my statement is 5 words. Is that too short?
Well, so here's how I'll answer that one. Because your artist statement is about your voice, there might be something very compelling about your work and these 5 words. And then that said, if a set of guidelines says, give us your artist statement in 100 words, it is likely that they're looking for a little bit more. It's likely that this is the part of, in terms of grant applications in particular, it's likely that they're looking for a little bit more to get a little bit more sense of who you are. And then, I think it also depends on the context. For private funders, depending on who they are, they might really get a kick out of that. I think in public dollar context, I think a little bit more would be required. Phil, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And oftentimes we see from the grant application side is, people writing them have to consider that those reading have, for the most part, probably absolutely no idea who you are as an artist or an organization. And this is your one chance to put it all out there. That doesn't mean you just write, way too much, but you've got to be concise and clear while keeping in mind that not everybody knows who you are as well as you or your friends. We've got another question here from Dan. Should artists apply for the grants themselves, or should they have a grant writer apply on their behalf?
Oh, interesting question. Let's see. So if you're going to hire someone, you'll have to pay them. And in part of paying them, you're going to have to tell them what you want them to write. I would say take a shot at it yourself. I would say you know your artistry best. I would say depending on the size of your program, I don't know that a grant professional would be required. Organizations certainly do it. Perhaps if the volume of what you're doing is at a level where you need some assistance, then that certainly would be a context. But here's, as a grants professional myself, here's the thing that I think that a lot of people, organizations, or individuals don't realize, is that as a proposal writer, the only thing I can do is write what you share with me and what you have available to convey. So it doesn't mean that I'm creating content for you. It means that the artist or organization must have the content and then convey it to me. And then I'm going to look at the guidelines and tailor it to the guidelines. So unless your work is at the volume where you need that type of support, I would recommend as individual artists that you set aside time to craft it yourself. And then part of what we'll be talking about later on is what are the guidelines asking so that it can make it more efficient for you.
And I would add on to that a lot of what you've talked about, Angela, in the beginning was about relationship cultivation as well, communicating with the funder. So a grant writer is not going to supplant that process. It's still, the artist still has to develop the relationship, has to have the conversations, has to be clear on the content and the intent. The writing of it, to your point, they're only going to write what content you provide. So it's probably better to write it yourself and then give it to a friend or someone trusted that knows sort of the world that world to help sort of advise and edit, right?
Yeah, I would agree. And I want to add one last thing that I just thought of as you were talking is for individuals in particular, your artistic voice needs to come through. So who you are as an artist and the voice of your work and the intention of your work. And so I think that especially for applications or guidelines or opportunities that are for individuals, they're looking for the voice of that individuals. And a grant writer, there could just be some challenge with that. So
yeah. So I think we'll take one more question before we move on to the next section. And it was just on the screen, so I'll wait and get that back. I believe it's from Isaac. Let's see if I can read it on this other screen. Oh, here it is. Okay. So Isaac A asks, so by putting the priority with our work, does this open the conversation up to how we can leverage innovation to benefit the funder, the artist, and other recipients?
100%. That is exactly the point of it. Like, so we.
In other words, propose more to the funder than they may have thought about. So there we go. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it includes that, yes. So when we put our work first, then we get to see the tendrils of opportunity for others. When we're so laser focused in a vacuum on, this $5,000 grant and this $500 grant, and we're sort of piecemealing it together, we don't quite put a bigger idea together. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, because I think as individuals, leveraging these opportunities, weaving them together so that you can have more impact is the way that we sustain our creative lives.
Yeah. Well, great advice, great content, great thoughts. So I'm gonna turn it back over to you to proceed to the next session, and then I'll see you in a little bit to answer some more questions that come up.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and thank you all for all of those questions. Keep them coming, and I'll answer as many as we have time for. Okay, next slide, please. So we're going to shift to approaching the guidelines. So we've talked a little bit about grantsmanship. We've talked a little bit about the types of funders that are out there. We've talked a little bit about planning our projects first so that we have a clear idea of what it is that we want to do. Let's assume now that we have some idea, a vision of what project we want to pursue or projects that we want to pursue. And then we find a grant maker that we're interested in. And how do we begin to approach these guidelines? So the first thing I want to underscore is that you want to look at the criteria to see if you're eligible. This is especially if you're in the realm of public funding. As I mentioned, there's this thing called the 5% rule for public foundations and private foundations. And that's why they mostly give to 501c3 or organizations. So you want to make sure that you're eligible before you go too far down the road with that. You want to look at the type of the typical award amount for this grant maker. This is important for a number of reasons. One, so you know how much to ask for, but also as you're thinking about leveraging funding. If let's say I come up with as I'm in my planning and I come up with, a collaboration I want to do with another artist, a performance that we're going to do, but I also need time I need studio time. So these three different elements of things that I want to fund, and let's say the grant maker that I come across is for $1,000. It doesn't mean that's too small. It just means that I need other funding. So how can I look at the types of amounts and how do I piece that together to fund the overall project or the overall year that I want to have? The next thing you want to look at is funding match. So for example, let's take those three things that I want to do. I want to look at the mission of that grant maker. So if that grant maker is really interested in community programs, arts education, youth, and I'm looking for studio time, that's not going to be a good match. It might be a good match for the part of the element of the community program I want to do, but if I'm looking for studio time, I might not want to apply to a grant funding source that requires me to have 4 community workshops, etc. So making sure that the purpose of the award is matching what it is that you're wanting to do so that it can support your creative life, not take you off path, right? There could be multiple things that you're doing. And then what are the requirements that are available there or required by that grant maker? And different ones have different requirements. So you want to look very closely at those requirements prior to beginning to write those applications because it'll make your work more efficient. Next slide, please. So as you're approaching these guidelines, here's a sample criteria that you may see for government funding. So as I mentioned previously, there's a criteria, you're often scored by it. So and they have different priorities. So for example, most of the time, the question that came up, or does it vary by different state? These criteria certainly might vary by different state, but typically they're looking for some version of these 5 things. Your artistic merit or quality, the quality of your project plan, which is what are you going to do? How are you going to do it? What are you hoping to achieve? Community engagement. How is it relevant to the community? How are you going to share it with the community? The quality of your work samples and your budget. Does your budget seem reasonable? So I want to look at these numbers on the right-hand side. It's particularly important when you're approaching guidelines to look at how grant makers are scoring the applications because it gives you helpful tips as to what's most important for them. So if we were to look at this example, the quality of the project plan, that is what are you going to do? When are you going to do it? How are you going to do it? Who's going to be involved in that? What are the results or outcomes that you're hoping to see with this project? It's the most amount of points. That means that that's what they're most interested in. Next slide, please. Versus, this is an actual snippet from a foundation where it says applications are evaluated on the basis of the quality of the artist's work and the potential to expand the aesthetic inquiry and its relationship to the foundation's priority. So that means that they're looking at work samples. They're looking at the quality of your artistic merit. They're scoring that more so than your plan, more so than the reasonableness of your budget. They're looking at who are you as an artist and how does it relate to us as a foundation in terms of what you want to do? So looking at criteria, whether it be in numbers or whether it be in the statement, will help you understand what to highlight in your guide and in your application. Next slide, please. So this is the core components of an arts grant proposal. So that part about the cover letter, these are some of the elements that you're going to want to include. So no matter whether it's a public dollars, private dollars, even an informal from an individual that says, tell me, send me a letter about what it is that you want to do. Most of these elements will be a part of it. And I'm going to go into them in detail. So the core components of an arts grant proposal tend to be your artist statement, whether that be the whole formal one, or they ask you a question about, tell us a little bit about who you are as an artist, et cetera, et cetera. The project description, the project goals and objectives, your evaluation. And I think this is, that's mostly with public dollars, but we'll get to that, and the budget. So these, almost no matter what application, private, government, individual, you will see these components come up. Next slide, please. So let's just break these down a little bit more one by one. So let's start with our artist statement. We talked about that as being important for getting ready to apply for grant funding as an individual artist. They tend to be required for almost every single proposal, fellowship, residency that you need. And I would also add, as a creative, we need to have a statement of what it is that we're doing, or what it is our intention for our work. Next slide, or keep going. So it describes the what, the how, and the why of your artistic vision. If you haven't reviewed your artist statement a while, or if you're still working on it, I just like to say that there are so many there's so many resources out there about writing a good artist statement. So I decided not to go into it here, but certainly on Candid, there are resources. Americans for the Arts have resources, but if you just put it into the Google box, you'll get more resources for writing an artist statement, what goes into it, how to make it compelling. Even that question of like how long is a really good one, because there are places where that 5-word artist statement will be helpful, like your website, for example. That might be the perfect place for it. And then for grant proposals, you might add to it a little bit. We'll see. Continue, please. And then knowing that your bio and your statement and your resume are all different. And looking at them as a totality can be a really good kind of audit that we can do as artists. So what does my bio say versus what does my statement say versus what's on my resume? Usually with guidelines, they will ask you for a combination of these things. Your resume, certainly, and then bio or statement. And making sure that your bio kind of tells them, where have you been? What's sort of your history of who you are, your influences, and then your statement is that artistic voice, that's that what, how, why of your artistic work. So all of these things, whether it's your bio or your statement, it's what makes your application stand out. It's the one opportunity, as Phil mentioned, that grant makers get to understand who you are as an artist versus the other application. You can imagine that reviewers have a little stack of proposals, so your bio and your statement in particular is what really has your application stand out from the next one. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's the artist statement, and then there's the project description. And the project description is the what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, who will be involved, where it's going to happen, and a timeline. Now, a word about this project description. Sometimes in applications, they say, tell us what you're going to do in 500 words or less. Remember that I'm advocating for doing the planning first. So I and the Grantsmanship Center, what we teach is about creating the entire best case scenario, every element of what you'd like to do, project description first, and then paring it down for the guidelines. So the more details that you're clear about, the more compelling and concise and clear your grant proposals are going to be. So some grant makers might not ask for a timeline. That's okay, because you're in the planning of it. If you understand, like, oh, this is going to be a 6-month program, and here are all the pieces that need to go in it. Even if that doesn't translate into the guidelines, you already understand what it is that you're going to do, so you can speak to it more clearly. The other way that that's important is because let's just assume you're going to get the grant. When it comes time to then implement, you already have your project plan articulated. So when it comes to creating this, I'm advocating for the planning out, as Isaac's question mentioned, so I can see the different components of it, and then I tailor it to the grant proposals based on the amount of space that I have. Next slide, please. Oh, and the tip, thank you. One tip for the project description here is, I as a writer, I tend to want to describe everything. I want to explain all of the things. Sometimes I'll come up with a line that I write, and I'm just like, oh, I love how this sounds. This is exactly what I do. But it goes beyond the page length. You want to only answer the questions that are in the grant application. Nothing extra, nothing else. It's a different thing with grant proposals, is that sometimes people think it's like the most flowery language, the most, high impact emotional stuff that you can put in there. It's not really the case. When it comes to grant proposals, to be totally honest, they can sometimes feel a little dry for us as creatives. But what we're trying to do is convey to another person who has no idea who we are, a little bit about who we are, why this project that we want to do is important, and why they should give us funding for it. So if anything, it's more of like a persuasive essay. So only ask what they want, because all the other stuff is distracting. Next slide, please. Thank you. So then beyond that, we've got our goals and objectives. This is still part of the program, the overall program description. So our goals, and I think that when it comes to goals and objectives, this is where we as individuals, it can be a challenging thing to do, because what's really the difference? So let me break that down a little bit. So goals are our specific measurable results that are bound to the length of the project. So what are we hoping that by the end of this project, what are the results that we're intending to see? So for an example of that could be, what's the exhibit? How many performances? Maybe there's a product, maybe there's a film, maybe you're going to do a film and a viewing. So by the end, what's the result, or what's the goal of this project? Now, a tip about goals, in some applications, they call them goals. In others, they call them project outcomes. So the names and the titles of these things can vary by guidelines, but it doesn't matter what the grant maker calls them, the funder calls them. Whether it's a goal or an outcome, it's geared at results. What will we see at the end of this project that's limited to the time of the grant funding? Next slide, please. And that's different from objectives. Objectives are the measurable descriptions of tasks. So one is results and one is tasks. So what they're looking for is how can you quantify what you're going to implement? So for example, to recruit 10 volunteers for the music festival to usher, right? So to recruit 10 volunteer ushers, right, for a certain music festival. The goal of that might be a 5-day music festival for 100, for seniors or whatever it is, right? But the tasks of it is, we've got to recruit 10 volunteers for these ushers. We've got to develop a score. We've got to, create a program, whatever it is. All the different tasks that you can quantify, those become the objectives. So goals and objectives work together. Goal being the end result, objectives being those things that are quantifiable that it'll take to reach that particular goal. And again, the names and the titles of these things can be different, but now that you've heard this, you can know that one of these things is going to be geared at a result and one is going to be geared at an activity. So next slide, please. Okay, still in project description, now we've got our evaluation. And I will say that usually you'll come up against evaluation when it comes to public funding more so than private funders, although not always, but oftentimes there's more accountability with public funding, which means that we as individuals have that accountability also. When it comes to evaluation, however, it doesn't mean you have to do this elaborate evaluation plan. You want it to be right size for what you are going to be able to do, right? So you're an individual, so it doesn't have to be hire someone or do 5 different surveys and do an interview. Keep it right size for what you're going to do. Keep it in response to what the stakeholder, and oftentimes that'll be the funder, what they're looking for, and they usually will give some guidance on that. And the thing to note about evaluation, and my background is in the arts. I also taught 5th grade for a little while. It wasn't until I became a teacher that I realized, evaluation is not just for the stakeholder. Evaluation is for me. Also, it benefits my project. It benefits my project because it allows me to know what I'm doing well and what I need to maybe adjust in my implementation. Not so much in my art, in my studio work, but as I go out and as I do exhibits or different things in the community, it allows me to know how can I improve in my implementation. Evaluation in the public realm, it also lets the grant maker know, you have to realize that grant funding it's a partnership, right? It's an invitation to be in partnership to do something in the community or to support an artist, you as an artist. And so part of what evaluation does is it provides the information about why this was a good social investment for them. So whether that be, evaluation could for in the case of an individual artist, could look like how many people come, what did they, a simple survey of what their takeaways were, whether or not whatever they learned. There's a lot of different things that you could do in evaluation. There's some great resources out there. And again, I'm going to underscore, keep it right sized so that it gives you good information. It gives you like a feedback loop, as opposed to being like just another thing that we're doing to satisfy the grant maker. Next slide, please. And then we want to talk about leveraging our projects. This came up in the question too. And I almost feel like this is, in addition to sort of grant readiness and understanding that the details of the project are, we want the grant maker to be able to read them one time through and understand them. Learning how to leverage your project and leveraging your grant funding will make your proposals even more compelling. Most grant makers, they want to know that yes, you're going to do the project that you're applying for, but that it's part of your ongoing creative life or your ongoing engagement in the community or in your artistry. So when it comes, here's a couple of things to think about when you're leveraging your project. So how can you maximize engagement? And that can be engagement with the community. It can be engagement with other artists, engagement with arts organizations. What beyond my studio work, how can I start to proliferate my work more and have grant funding help be a vehicle for achieving that proliferation? Next point, please. How can I leverage grant awards with other funding? In a moment, we're going to get to the project budget. Grant makers, sometimes people are nervous to share with grant makers that they're getting funding from other sources, when it's actually the opposite. Grant makers are anticipating, are expecting that you're getting funding from other sources, whether that be other grant makers, whether that be individual patrons, whether that be from the merchandise that you sell. You can use grant funds to leverage other funding. I've seen individual artists do really interesting things like share with their community that they received a $5,000 award from a particular grant maker, and then try to, with their other patrons, match it. Right. So next point, you can look to match grant awards. You can use them to reach a larger goal. So this is where creating your project plan first, so that you know, okay, these are the tendrils of what I want to do in this project. I want studio time. I want collaborations with this collective. I want this exhibit. This is how much it's going to cost. And then look at how each grant application and other funding sources that you have can support you. And don't forget to pay yourself, of course. Next point, please. So we look to build these partnerships so that we can leverage impact that being our work. Like ultimately, we are creating work and we're sharing our work. And so how can I look at partnerships that can, and that could be something like studio time and collaborating with an organization to show my work or host my work or allow me to be in residency there. Next slide, please. And then our final topic is program budgets. How do we create them? What goes in them? What are some of the words that we might see around project budgets, and what are grant makers looking for? So when it comes to our program budget, we are giving them a very detailed estimate of the expenses that go into our project. What do we need to implement this program or this project? Grant makers are also looking for a detailed list of other resources. So as I mentioned, they're not anticipating that they're the only ones. And so where is the funding going to come from? And the other reason that's significant is because unfortunately, not every application that we apply for, we receive. And so when we have this project plan, and we know how much it's going to cost to do it, then some of the monies that we will receive, we know that we're going to do the project anyways, whether or not this grant funding comes in or not. And so having more revenues and resources to demonstrate that will actually support your application. When it comes to your expenses, you want to make sure that they're researched. In other words, let's take something like buying a computer. Let's say you do graphic work and you're going to upgrade your system in order to do this new exhibit, right? Rather than saying, computers are about $5,000 because I need the certain software. You want to have very detailed estimates of what it's going to cost, because remember, on the other side of this are people that are reviewing it that have an idea of how much things cost. And you want to create backup notes. A lot of times there's this thing called a budget narrative, which I'll show you an example of in a moment, where they ask for the explanation of your estimates. So again, this is all part of that planning process. So rather than doing this every time you get an application, when we create these larger plans, including the research of how much it's going to cost with notes to it, we only have to do that one time. And then we can input it into the different applications and tailor it to the different applications as needed. Next slide, please. So you want to make sure that your budget reflects your objectives and your evaluation section, meaning that if you wrote it in the narrative, it should find its way to the budget. And if it's in the budget, it should be described in the narrative. So what you don't want is for a reviewer to read your project description and be like, oh, that's so great, love that, it's right in line with what I want to do. And then they get to the budget and those expenses are not they're not written out, they're not shown, they're not demonstrated. Or vice versa, they are looking at the budget and they see all these line item expenses and there's nothing about it in the narrative. So the budget and your narrative tell the exact same story in different language. So they need to be mirrors of each other. Next slide, please. And the types of resources that you're going to include in your budget are going to include cash resources. So that's monies that are coming in, other grant funding sources, money from your merchandise. Maybe you have a fellowship. Maybe you have done a Kickstarter, or there's individual donations that you have secured. Maybe you're on Patreon. So there's cash resources that are supporting you. Then there's in-kind resources. And in-kind resources they tend to be supplies or space or volunteer time. They're resources that support your project, but there's not a cash exchange for them. So they're donations, donated items, goods and services. And then there's matching resources. And for some grant makers, you may see this thing where they're looking for matching resources. There was this one grant maker that I worked with once where they were offering what they called challenge grants. So each artist had to raise a certain amount of money and then they would match it, up to a certain level. So they want matching resources as well. So who else is helping to fund this particular project? Next. And then I wanted to put together just an example of what you might see in terms of grant proposals and budgets and what grant makers are looking for. So if they don't give you a format, first of all, you want to follow the format they give you. So this is just an example. And if they give you a format, use that format. That said, if there is no format, this would be an example of how you could construct a project budget. And certainly in your planning, you could use this format. So just a few things I want to highlight in this example is, so we have the line item, which is a detailed description of the calculation of the expense. So people sometimes ask me, does it need to be this specific? And my answer is yes, because it shows that you've done the research and you know how much it's going to cost. And more importantly, it conveys to the reviewer how you arrived at these calculations. So there's the line item, and then the next column is the request. That's the request, meaning what I'm requesting from this particular grant maker. The other category, that's the next one, that's other resources. And this is a combination of cash resources, meaning other monies that I have to support my project, as well as in-kind resources. So it's a combination of cash and in-kind in that column. And then what's the total expense? So I want to highlight a couple of things. So in our budgets, we want to include our personnel. I've seen guidelines where they want to see that you're paying yourself, or that there's other artists involved, or whatever it is, that you're paying your people. So we've got stipends there first, and how I arrived at those monies. And then there's non-personnel, and those tend to be the bucket of everything else. Everything from our supplies to our marketing materials, printing, copying, and space. So I want to just highlight how we delineate these things. Let's take a look at non-personnel number one. So our artistic supplies. So I have $500 a month times 6 months. You might say, is that arbitrary? How do I come up with that? How much is too much? This comes from historical information. When you look at your life as an artist, and if you're not doing this now, as you start becoming even more savvy with grants, you'll begin to have more of this information. And you look at, what do I spend in supplies on a monthly basis? And then you can average that out over time. So when I look at this item, as an artist, I spend $500 a month, on average. So for this particular grant application, I'm requesting $600, and the other amount, the $2,400, that's going to come from other resources. And at the very bottom of this budget, you'll see some narrative that I have. In this case, I have a project crowdfunding source. So I'm demonstrating to the grant maker that I am requesting some supply money, but I also have this other source that's coming in that's gonna help offset the cost of it. It's $3,000 to do the work I want to do. That's what I need. And so I'm looking at how to piece and puzzle this together for myself. Another example would be line item number 5, where I need space. I'm going to hold a workshop here, and I need space, but I've got a relationship with our local art center, and they're going to donate the space. So this $2,000 in that category is a donated space by the City Art Center. Now, that's not cash that I have to pay out, but it is a resource. So you can think of this budget as a resource budget. So it's a $2,000 resource that I have. If I was to rent that space, that's how much it would cost. So I'm counting that to demonstrate this is how we leverage other resources that we have. So I'm needing some cash money. In this case, my request is $3,600, but I've got $8,000 in other resources, a combination of donated things and cash resources. So when a reviewer looks at my budget and they notice that my total project is 11,640, they can see that I'm doing this project anyway because I've got these other resources, and I'm inviting them to be a partner in this project that I'm going to do. And so this budget positions my application in a very strong way because the amount that I'm looking is about a third of what I need. And so it demonstrates that to the funder that I am planning. I'm taking a longer view in terms of my project, that I'm inviting them on as a partner, but it's not the sole money that I need. And so it positions our projects well. Next slide, please. So then just to recap before we take a few questions. So grantsmanship is where we started. Grantsmanship is about building relationships, and it's about developing a project plan for your artistic vision and to support your creative life, I'd also add. So when we start to approach our grant readiness, we're thinking about what we want to do, what our plan is, what our overall vision is, and then there's those tasks to do to get grant ready. Next slide. We want to know our audience, whether it's a private funder or public dollars, government sources, so because that will help us to know what about our eligibility, number one, and about the criteria that's needed. So we want to know our audience and know who we're applying to, so we know what to emphasize in our applications. We want to create realistic budgets that are based on research that we've done, and use those budgets to leverage our project, making sure that whatever we write about is matched in our budget. And then this question that I hope to leave you with is, how do I leverage my grant proposals? How do I leverage one grant proposal, whether it be for Broward County or from a private foundation? How do I begin to think about this not just as a standalone resource, but one piece of this overall funding plan that I have to support my creative life? That's how we as creatives, we as artists begin to shore up the business side of our creative lives. Next. So I'll just leave with a couple of resources from the Grantsmanship Center that are available. The first one is this book. It's called Program Planning and Proposal Writing. It's available on Amazon as well as through our website, tgci.com. It's almost a compendium and expands on the work that I've talked about here. It talks about what goes into the different sections, what makes for what grant makers are looking for, and what makes for a compelling project plan and therefore proposal. There's the Meet the Grant Makers online. That's the webinar that's free, where you can hear from other grant makers. We also offer other webinars and trainings and articles and things of that nature. If you want to stay connected to the work of the Grantsmanship Center to continue to shore up your skills, you can get on the mailing list and get more information about that. All right, I think it's time for some questions.
Nice to be back here virtually with you, Angela. All great stuff, and I think some of the big takeaways for me, at least, is there's so much about planning and clarity in how artists and organizations approach this process of coming to the table with what we would, I guess, say a fully baked proposal. It's great to have ideas. It's frustrating as from the funder side when you get a proposal and it sounds amazing and the decision is made to fund it, and then you have to go back. The artist comes back and wants to change everything because everything they proposed, they've realized once they've got the grant, is not actually possible to do in the terms that they've done. So coming to it, and I think you said it so well in your opening, where you said it's your artistic practice or process has to come first, and then seeking those funding opportunities that where your artistic practice and vision aligns with the funder's priorities, as opposed to chasing that money. I always say it's better to, and tell me what you think about this, it's better to under promise and then overperform as opposed to overpromise and then underperform.
I agree with that 100%.
Yeah. So I know we've got some questions here that we'll throw up on the screen. So again, we've got a few minutes here for some questions. So if you did not already put them in the chat box, please put them in the chat box, and our team will throw them up. So we have another question from Art Sanctum. Who reviews these government grant applications?
Great question. So in general, and Phil, maybe you can be specific for Broward County, but in general, government agencies, whether it's federal or county, they convene a panel. And it's usually a panel of people from the community that have some expertise in whatever the topic is. So artists or arts administrators, et cetera. And so they convene a panel to review and score the applications. I think it's usually the staff will kind of go through the eligibility, and then it goes to a review panel for content. And then after that, they make the decision as to what amounts will be dispersed.
Yeah, and it's very similar to what we do in Broward County. We actually, each year we do a call for citizen art experts to participate. So they're people from the Broward or we're very regional here. So we do have grant reviewers that are residents of, say, Palm Beach County or Miami-Dade County. And there are certain qualifications. They can't just be Joe Schmo off the street, but they're generally artists, they're arts administrators, they're people that sit on arts boards that are experts in those fields. And then we take a lot of care and time and intentionality in making sure that those citizen review panels are representative of the community, so that we put performing arts professionals on grant panels that are evaluating performing arts proposals. And then our grant review panels, COVID aside, are public affairs, so you can actually come and sit and listen to your application or other applications being discussed by the panel. It's a way for us to try to provide some transparency in the process, to know how things are scored, what the discussion is, and then in our case, those that apply actually get a printout, summation of the comments by the review panel as a way to try and go back and help them the next time if they weren't successful in getting that grant. So that's a little bit about how our process works.
Yeah, and I would add that it's similar across other states. Maybe not, it might vary a little. I love that part about being able to come and listen. That's really amazing. A lot of times agencies will offer written things and stuff like that. So it's a great, for those of you that are art makers, it's also a great process. Maybe not if you can't do it if you're applying, but later down the road to be a reviewer, you can learn a lot.
I think sometimes on the private funding side and the corporate funding side, a lot of the challenge is lack of transparency and knowing how things are scored, who's reviewing. And again, on the public side, we try to provide that transparency as much as we can. Another comment, Connie McKnight, or question: what is the best format to show the committee your work? A PDF that includes many pictures, or a document with links to find your work?
My experience is that grant makers will be very specific about how they want you to submit your work samples. And so you want to provide it the way that they specify it, whether it's high resolution images or et cetera. That said, documents or links is typically not the best way to do that. I guess it depends, but for example, I was on a panel and there was a lot of links, and what they told us is that you can go to the links, but your application should be a standalone application. So you're not sending reviewers to other locations unless it's got really big files, but usually they will provide, here's how we want you to submit it. If they don't do that, I would err towards figuring out a way to provide them with the files.
And one other bit of advice to piggyback on yours is definitely pay attention as much as you can to what the funder specifies as the formats or length of time. Nothing is more frustrating as a reviewer to get a work sample and then have to search a 60-minute YouTube video for the specific time that's referenced in the application. So giving exactly what you want the review panel to see and not making them search for for whatever information it is that you're trying to provide. So next question. So Charles Clark III, is there a thought either of you could offer for artists whose topics and themes could be considered risque, i.e. Art made by people who are incarcerated, or performing art pieces dealing with religion and rap music?
I would say I don't think those are risque at all. I think that they are, I think when you're an artist, the work that you do is what you do. And I think that it would be matching the work that you do with the right funder, right? So I might not, maybe I wouldn't submit my performing arts pieces dealing with religion to a religious conservative, funder. Probably not the right fit, but I would think in general, those, when you do the research on your grant makers, you will see what their missions are too. And so you want to match your work with those whose missions would support your work. It's not about converting or, trying to make them see. It's just like find the right match of their mission, what they talk about, the flavor of that funding source. Certainly if it's public dollars, and Phil can speak to this, there tends to be, especially now, kind of an inclusive net of not just in terms of who we are as people, but the types of work that we put out. So.
Yeah, and I agree. I think, one of the things that agencies are not trying to be are censors, but at the same, from the public side, we have to be conscious of what public money is funding. So there are certain things that we don't fund, and so we may not fund, say, a play that the purpose of that play is to promote a specific form of religion. But you can be a religious institution or organization and apply for arts programming that has an artistic focus. So there are some differences. I would just encourage anybody to call the funder and have these conversations with them. Most of them have contact information on websites and are happy to discuss, so that you can see if it's a good fit. We did have another question up on the screen that went away. Can we get that back, team? So great workshop. Thank you, Dana. What do you think are any other mistakes artists make in their grants, aside from having a clear voice and a budget that is realistic and matches the project narrative?
Other mistakes. Rushing, I think, is a challenge with grant proposals in general. And like cut and paste is very evident. So I would underscore giving yourself enough time, because I've reviewed hundreds of proposals, and you can always tell when things are rushed. These proposals take longer than you would expect. And there's a little bit of, thinking about work samples, there's some technicalities, making sure that your systems talk to each other and, that type of thing. So giving yourself enough space and time. Let's see. I would also add, this one seems kind of elementary, but it's the following the directions of what the grant maker is asking. Tends to be a really difficult thing for some reason. It could be maybe that people don't understand what the questions are, or, they just decide they want to give other information, but really following the directions kind of to the letter in a kind of almost it's a very structured process in that regard, so that the application that the reviewer gets is concise, that, question one, the answer answers question one, and the next one answers question two, being pretty methodical in terms of how you do it. Let me see if there's anything else that's coming to mind. And poor work samples. Yeah,
I think that work samples is always a struggle for artists, and oftentimes it seems like artists are and it makes sense, you're so concerned with executing the project that we forget to document it with quality pictures, with video, and what you end up with is somebody's iPhone video from the back of an auditorium with people standing in the front, or it's all moving every which way. So I think that's very well stated. Two more questions. How is the artist stipend calculated?
Well, I would say, so the one on my budget was fairly arbitrary and out of context. I would two things I would say. Number one, I would think about this is back to our planning. You're probably noticing I'm like beating the planning drum here, but it's first like I would look at what do I need to pay these individuals for the amount of time. Something that feels like a livable wage. It's going to vary based on where you live. Certainly here in LA, we've got some I wouldn't call them standards, but suggestions for the amount of work and that it's going to take. Yeah, those are like, how much do I need? I as an artist, and how much do the people that work with me need? And what is sort of standard for the location where I am?
I would also add that some of its proportionality, to the project. I mean, if you have a project and your budget is $10,000 and $8,000 of it is paying for you, and the other $2,000
good point
is paying for other things, and that's just a stark example. But a reviewer could look at that budget and say, okay, well, I don't get why this does not make sense. Why are you paying yourself 80% and your partners are only getting 1,000 of it? So you also have to keep in mind what's appropriate to the size of the project and making sure that it doesn't look like this is just an opportunity to pad your wallet.
Fair enough. And I would add, that's a great point. Just one that made me think of something else is that look to the guidelines for that too, because a lot of grant makers, they will give you some guidance about what they're wanting to fund. Some right. Funders are really like, we want to fund artists and we want to fund livable wages by artists, and others are looking for more project-oriented funding. So right. That's a discernment too.
All right, last question. So I have a lot of experience outside of the USA, but none in the USA. Would this hurt my chances to win a proposal?
I would say no, unless we're looking at eligibility of the criteria, if that's what you're asking. I'm a little unclear. Like if you're a citizen or something like that, and it needs to go to U.S. citizens, and that would be an eligibility thing. And then if you're talking about in terms of your shows and artwork, etc., I think there's for public dollars, I think there can oftentimes be some eligibility, like you need to be a resident of a certain county or location for a certain number of time before you can apply for funding. Those are the two things that kind of come to mind for me.
Yeah, and I would say success is success. So if you've not exhibited your work or performed within the U.S., but you've done extensively outside of the U.S., but you're a resident, that's still demonstrating your success and the quality of your product as a U.S. citizen. But again, I think to your point, it's probably more about eligibility and whether or not someone is eligible within the county, the city, the state, or the U.S. Because many grants, if you're not a U.S. citizen, then you can't apply. But I will say there are a lot of grant opportunities through the U.S. State Department or through other embassies or other NGOs that could potentially be an option. So. Any other questions we want to? Okay, we have no other questions, but I will say to those of you watching online, if you do have other questions that end up in the chat, when after we've stopped answering questions, we will go back and make sure that we answer those questions in the comments. So, Angela, I want to thank you so very much for your time and for being with us. And you're in LA, so I know that's 3 hours behind us. So a 10:30 a.m. Eastern time is pretty damn early for you on the West Coast. So I appreciate you getting up early and joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and to all of you viewing online, thank you for being here and for being with us. I do want to say that Broward County Cultural Division offers grants directly to artists. I will say with a caveat that those grants are only available to artists that reside or have residence here in Broward County. So if you don't live in Broward County, hey, feel free to move and move your residence here to the county and become one of our great artists. Our artists support grants, which go directly to artists. We've got an application workshop, couple application workshops coming up. They are virtual on August 11th, one in the morning at 10:30 a.m., one at 5:30 p.m. Our artist support grants for the upcoming fiscal year are allocating almost $250,000 in direct artist support for anywhere from amounts from $500 to $3,000 on the top end to support specific artists' projects. So this session, remember, was recorded and will be posted on our YouTube and our Facebook channels following this live stream. Don't forget to RSVP for next week's session. I will say there are course materials that you need before the session. So when you RSVP and you send us your information, we'll actually send you those materials beforehand. Obviously, if you don't get the materials or aren't able to get them in advance, you can still tune in, but it would be helpful to have those materials in advance. We have a couple of opportunities for artists to mention before we sign off. Right now, we have a call to artists for Fort Lauderdale International Airport for one of our rotating exhibitions in the Terminal 2 Art Gallery. Artists will receive a $2,500 stipend, so check out the link to that opportunity for specifics. We also have a call that ARLIC, the African American Research Library and Cultural Center, is doing. It's one of Broward County's libraries. It's Art for Art and Activism, and that comes actually with a $10,000 stipend with an additional $2,000 for materials. The deadline is July 31st for that opportunity. Our Fort Lauderdale International Airport opportunity deadline is July 30th. So check out the information. We're also accepting the last few applications for our Public Art and Design Artist Selection Panel. That application is due July 30th, and those artist selection panels evaluate and advise on public art projects. The deadline for our artist support grant is September 17th, so get signed up for those virtual application workshops, August 11th at 10:30 a.m. and 5:30 p.m. So with that, I want to thank you from the staff and team at Broward County Cultural Division and our friends at Arc Labs that have helped with this virtual production. We're live. You can't see behind the screen, but there is a team and an army of people feeding me comments and making sure that I don't mess up. So I appreciate the support and all of them being here. So thank you and goodbye.